Every evening as the sun sinks below the city skyline, a lone dog curls up outside St. Vincent Hospital. His fur is matted, tangled with dirt, his thin frame barely holding on to strength. But his eyes, deep, unwavering, stay fixed on the entrance, waiting. Dr. Michael Hayes, an overworked ER physician, steps out after another exhausting shift. He rubs his tired eyes, adjusting his coat against the biting wind. Just as he reaches the parking lot, he notices the dog, still, silent, watching. A security guard nearby notices Michael's lingering gaze. That dog's been here for weeks. Michael frowns, glancing back at the hospital doors. Weeks? No one's come for him? The guard shakes his head. Nope, doesn't beg, doesn't leave, just waits. A cold gust of wind rushes past, but Michael hardly notices. Waiting for what? Or for who? Every night Michael saw the same dog outside the hospital. It always sat in the same spot, just across the street, staring into the distance as if waiting for someone. At first, Michael didn't think much of it. But as the nights passed, the dog's presence began to unsettle him. Every night, as Michael left the hospital, the dog was there, sometimes lying on the wet pavement, sometimes looking up at the sky as if waiting for a sign. There was a strange sadness in its eyes, as if holding on to a hope that refused to fade. One night, as the rain grew heavier, Michael stopped. He pulled up his coat collar and crouched near the dog. For a moment, he just watched it, then softly spoke. "Why are you here every night? Are you waiting for someone?" Narration. The dog gazed at him in silence, its wet eyes glistening with an unspoken longing. Just then, a nurse walked by. She glanced at Michael, then spoke in a quiet voice. "That dog, he belonged to a patient, Mr. Caldwell. He passed away a few weeks ago." Narration. Michael felt his heart sink. He looked back at the dog, still sitting there, still waiting. It had no idea its owner was gone. Narration. And in that moment, Michael realized the dog was waiting for someone who would never return. Night after night in the same spot, with the same hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight his owner would come back. Michael couldn't shake the image of the dog from his mind. Every night he saw him in the same spot, silent, still, waiting. Curiosity turned into concern. Who was this dog waiting for? One afternoon during a break, Michael sat at his desk and searched the hospital records. Mr. Caldwell, a retired teacher, no family, admitted weeks ago, and never made it out. His only companion? A stray dog he rescued years ago. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The dog wasn't just waiting, he was grieving. That evening, as Michael stepped out of the hospital, he saw the dog curled up on the cold pavement. His small frame trembled in the evening chill. With a sigh, Michael walked to his car, opened the door, and grabbed the blanket he kept in the back seat. "Here," he murmured, crouching down, draping the blanket over the dog. "This should help." The dog flinched at first, but didn't run. For the first time, he looked up at Michael, really looked. His dark, sorrowful eyes met Michael's, and for a moment there was a silent understanding between them. Over the next few nights, Michael started bringing food, setting it down, a few feet away. At first, the dog waited until Michael left before eating. Then slowly he started eating while Michael sat nearby. Still, he never left the hospital doors. Michael sighed one evening, watching the dog curl up again in the freezing cold. His breath formed mist in the air as he crouched down. "You're not gonna leave, are you?" The dog just blinked, his body shivering against the night air. Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "All right, buddy, I can't let you freeze out here. You're coming with me." He reached out slowly. The dog tensed but didn't move away. Carefully, Michael scooped him up, feeling the bony frame beneath his fur. As he carried the dog to his car, he whispered, "You don't have to wait anymore." Michael drove through the empty streets, the soft hum of the car engine filling the silence. In the passenger seat, curled up on the old blanket Michael had given him days before, lay the dog. His small, frail body trembled slightly, whether from the cold or fear Michael couldn't tell. As they reached home, Michael pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine. He turned to the dog. "All right, buddy. We're here." The dog lifted his head slightly, his weary eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Michael hesitated before reaching over, gently stroking the dog's back. "Let's get you inside." He carried the dog inside, careful not to startle him. The house was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Michael placed the dog down on a soft blanket near the couch, setting a bowl of water and some food nearby. The dog sniffed the air but didn't move. He sat there, eyes darting toward the door as if waiting for something, or someone. Michael exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You still think he's coming back, don't you?" The dog didn't blink. He just kept staring at the door, an uncertain start. The first few days were hard. The dog, whom Michael had started calling Shadow, was still wary. He wouldn't eat unless Michael left the room. He wouldn't explore the house, wouldn't play, wouldn't even rest properly. Every night he sat by the front door, head resting on his paws, waiting. Michael tried everything. He sat with Shadow, talked to him in hushed tones, left treats nearby, but nothing seemed to break the dog's silent vigil. The waiting never stopped. One evening, after another exhausting shift at the hospital, Michael slumped onto the couch. He watched as Shadow curled up near the door again, his small body still tense, still expectant. Michael sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "You don't trust me yet, do you?" The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Michael let out a soft chuckle. "Can't say I blame you. I wouldn't trust me either." He leaned back, closing his eyes. "I never let anyone get too close. Never thought I needed to. Work was enough. Life was simple." He turned his head slightly, gazing at the dog. "But you're still waiting for someone who's never coming back. And I don't know how to tell you that." The room was silent, except for the slow, steady breathing of the two souls, one human, one canine, both lost in their own ways. Slowly a bond forms. The days stretched into weeks. Shadow was still hesitant, still lingering near the door, but small changes began to emerge. One morning, Michael woke up to find Shadow, not by the door, but near the couch, his eyes barely opened, his body relaxed for the first time. Michael smiled to himself. Progress. Then, another shift. Shadow no longer flinched when Michael walked too close. He started eating while Michael was in the room. He would quietly follow Michael from the kitchen to the living room, still cautious but present. One night, as Michael worked on some paperwork, he felt a soft weight against his leg. He looked down and saw Shadow resting his head against him, his dark eyes heavy with sleep. Michael swallowed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. "You're trusting me now, huh?" he whispered. Shadow let out a small sigh and closed his eyes. Michael, who had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding attachments, suddenly realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. A home at last. As the months passed, the changes in Shadow became undeniable. He no longer sat by the door at night. He would wag his tail, just slightly, when Michael came home. He even started bringing a small toy Michael had bought him, dropping it near his feet as if asking for attention. One rainy evening, Michael sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the dark clouds rolling in. Shadow sat beside him, his fur slightly damp from the mist. Michael took a deep breath. "You know, I think I get it now. You weren't just waiting for him. You were waiting for someone to remind you that you weren't alone." Shadow turned his head, looking at Michael. Then slowly he rested his head against Michael's knee. Michael smiled, running a hand through the dog's fur. "Maybe I was waiting too. Because sometimes, the ones we think we're rescuing are actually rescuing us. The evening air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Michael sat on his porch, a warm cup of coffee in his hands, staring out at the quiet neighborhood. The world felt strangely peaceful, a contrast to the chaotic, high-pressure environment of the hospital he had just left. Beside him, Shadow lay curled up, his dark eyes half closed, ears twitching at the distant sounds of the city. The transformation in him was remarkable. The frail, frightened stray who once refused to leave the hospital doors had now found a new place to belong. But in some ways, Michael realized, Shadow wasn't the only one who had changed. Michael took a deep breath, setting his coffee down on the wooden railing. He glanced at Shadow, who seemed more relaxed than ever before. A small smile formed at the corners of Michael's lips. "You waited for him for so long," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you were waiting for me too." Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of Michael's voice. Slowly, he lifted his head and gazed at him with those same deep, knowing eyes that had first caught Michael's attention outside the hospital. And then, ever so gently, Shadow wagged his tail, just once before resting his head against Michael's knee. Michael felt his throat tighten. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything they had both been through. Loss, loneliness, waiting. But now, the waiting was over. The true meaning of rescue. As the days passed, Michael found himself reflecting on the journey that had led them here. He had never considered himself an emotional person. He was a man of logic, of science, someone who solved problems and moved on. But Shadow had taught him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn, that some wounds weren't meant to be treated with medicine. Some wounds needed time, patience, and companionship. Michael often thought back to the first night he had brought Shadow home, how the dog had refused to leave the front door, how he had barely eaten, how despite being given warmth and comfort, he had still longed for something, or someone, who was never going to return. Michael understood that feeling all too well. For years, he had buried himself in work, using his demanding schedule as an excuse to avoid forming real connections. He told himself he didn't need anyone, that he preferred solitude, that emotions only complicated things. But then came Shadow. Shadow, who refused to give up on the one he had loved. Shadow, who waited even when there was nothing left to wait. For Shadow, who had unknowingly forced Michael to confront the very thing he had spent years running from. And now, here they were, not alone, not waiting, but moving forward, together, a quiet understanding. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, sending golden leaves drifting across the porch. Michael absent-mindedly ran a hand through Shadow's thick fur, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I used to think people like me didn't need attachments, that it was better to focus on work and keep things simple." Shadow let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden floor. Michael chuckled. "Yeah, I know, it sounds ridiculous now." He stared ahead at the fading sunset, his mind wandering. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his next shift, his next surgery, or the never-ending pile of paperwork waiting for him at the hospital. Instead, he was thinking about this moment, about the quiet presence of the dog beside him, about how somehow, without even realizing it, Shadow had become more than just a rescue. He had become family. Michael sighed and leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing his weight more firmly against Michael's leg. "You're staying, aren't you?" Michael asked, already knowing the answer. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink, didn't need to. His quiet presence was answer enough. Michael reached for his coffee again, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. A comfortable silence settled between them, one that no longer felt heavy or filled with unspoken grief. For so long, Shadow had waited outside that hospital, hoping for someone who would never return. And for so long, Michael had avoided looking for anything or anyone outside of his work. But fate had a way of bringing lost souls together. Shadow had needed a home, and Michael had needed something he hadn't even realized he was missing. The sky darkened and the first stars began to appear. Michael let out a slow breath. Sometimes, he murmured, the ones we think we rescue end up rescuing us instead. Shadow let out a soft sigh as if he understood, and maybe in some way he did. As the screen fades from Michael and Shadow sitting together on the porch, the camera slowly zooms out, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. Then, the words appear, on screen. Sometimes the greatest love stories are written in silence, waiting just outside the door. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of love, loyalty, and second chances to life. Subscribe for more incredible stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that love always finds a way.